The grand conference hall was filled with the richest and most powerful people in the world. The air smelled of expensive cologne, freshly brewed coffee, and polished wood. This was no ordinary gathering. It was a global leadership summit where the best minds discussed the future. Among the speakers was Morgan Freeman, the man with a voice so powerful it could calm a storm. He was invited as a guest of honor to share wisdom about leadership, life, and humility. But sitting just a few seats away from him was Richard Langston, a billionaire CEO, known for his sharp tongue and arrogance. He had built a tech empire from the ground up, but his success had made him ruthless. He believed money was power, and he never cared who he stepped on to climb higher. The debate began. Morgan Freeman spoke about humility, kindness, and wisdom being the true marks of a great leader. But Langston scoffed, rolling his eyes. "With all due respect, Mr. Freeman," Langston interrupted with a smirk, "wisdom is overrated. In business, money is power. The strongest survive. Kindness is just a weakness." The room fell silent. Morgan Freeman, known for his patience, took a slow, deep breath. His face didn't change, but something in his eyes flickered. Something deep. Something old. And then he spoke. Morgan Freeman leaned forward slightly, his deep, steady voice filling the room. "Mr. Langston," he said, "I have lived longer than you. I have seen empires rise and fall. I have seen men like you, full of arrogance, believing they are untouchable. And do you know what happens to them?" Langston smirked. "They win?" Freeman shook his head, his eyes heavy with truth. "They crumble." The words landed like a hammer. The entire room held its breath. "Money is power, you say, and yet I have seen billionaires die alone, their wealth unable to buy them one more breath. I have seen the strongest men break, crying in empty rooms, realizing too late that strength without wisdom is just destruction." Langston's smile faded. Freeman continued, "You measure success in dollars, but I have sat beside dying men who would trade all their fortunes for one more moment with the people they ignored. You call kindness weakness, yet it is kindness that has saved more lives than wealth ever could. A pin could drop and it would echo." Langston swallowed hard, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. "That's a nice speech," he muttered, his voice quieter now. "But I built my empire with strength, not kindness." Freeman sighed. And then he said something that made even the most powerful men in the room freeze in fear. Morgan Freeman's voice dropped lower, softer, but it hit even harder. "Let me tell you a true story, Mr. Langston," he said. Everyone leaned in, even Langston. "There was once a man just like you, a billionaire. He thought he ruled the world. He stepped on people, hurt them, laughed at wisdom. He believed money could protect him from everything. But one day his bodyguards couldn't stop what was coming." Langston's jaw tightened. Freeman continued, his voice calm but powerful. "This man had everything, until the day he lost his only son. A heart attack right in front of him. He had every doctor, every medicine money could buy, but nothing could bring the boy back." The room felt cold now. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some wiped their eyes. Freeman locked eyes with Langston. "Do you know what that man did next?" he asked. Langston shook his head, his confidence cracking. "He fell to his knees," Freeman said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And for the first time in his life, he cried, because in that moment he finally understood. The most valuable things in life aren't bought with money." Langston said nothing. His hands trembled slightly, and then Freeman delivered the final blow. "But by then," he said, "it was too late." Langston's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. He wasn't just listening, he was feeling every word. The room remained in. The silence in the room was unbearable. Richard Langston, the billionaire who had never been humbled, sat frozen. His face was pale. Morgan Freeman's words had sliced through him like a blade, cutting past his wealth, his power, his pride. But still, the arrogance in him fought back. "So what?" Langston muttered. His voice was weaker now. "Are you saying I should run my company with kindness? That I should let people walk all over me?" Freeman shook his head. "No, Mr. Langston," he said, his voice slow, measured. "I am saying that power without wisdom is a curse." Langston forced a laugh. "You're talking like an old man who doesn't understand the world anymore." Freeman leaned forward, locking eyes with him. "I understand it better than you ever will," he said, "because I have lived long enough to see what happens to men like you. I have seen them grow old and bitter. I have seen them reach the top, only to look down and realize they have no one left to share it with." Langston's fingers curled into fists. His breathing was uneven. And then, Freeman spoke again. "I hope you never have to meet the ghosts of regret, Mr. Langston," he said, "because when they come, they never leave." Langston shuddered. The conference hall was still packed with people, but to Langston, it suddenly felt empty. For years, he had been surrounded by yes men, people who laughed at his jokes, nodded at his words, praised his every move. Yet now, as he looked around, he saw none of them would be there if he lost everything. He swallowed hard. Freeman saw it. "You think success is about power," Freeman continued. "But power is only as strong as the people who stand beside you. And tell me, Mr. Langston, who stands beside you when the doors close?" Langston had no answer. Freeman nodded slowly. "I once knew a man like you," he said. Langston flinched. He already knew he wouldn't like this story. Freeman continued. "He built an empire. He ruled with fear. He demanded respect but never earned love. And when he finally reached the peak of his success, he turned around to celebrate." He paused. The room waited, hanging on his every word. "But there was no one there," Freeman whispered. Langston exhaled, his body stiff. Freeman leaned back. "A throne means nothing," he said, "if it sits in an empty room." Langston's heartbeat pounded in his ears. Langston had heard enough. He stood abruptly, his chair scraped against the polished floor. "I don't need a lecture," he snapped. "I've built my empire without anyone's help. I don't need love, I need results." Freeman sighed, rubbing his hands together as if warming them. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folded letter. "I wasn't going to share this," Freeman said, "but maybe it's time." The audience shifted in their seats. Langston frowned. Freeman unfolded the letter carefully, as if it were fragile. "This," he said softly, "was written by a man who thought just like you. A man who once believed money was enough." He cleared his throat and read, "To whoever finds this, I want you to know, I had everything. I had wealth, power, respect, but I lost the one thing that mattered, the people who truly cared for me. And now, I sit alone in this mansion, drowning in regret. If you are reading this, I beg you, don't make my mistake. Love is worth more than gold." Freeman looked up. His eyes were sad, but steady. "The man who wrote this," he said, "was found dead in his estate 2 days later, alone." Langston's face lost all color, because he recognized the handwriting. It belonged to a man he once admired, a man who had died without a single soul at his funeral. And suddenly, for the first time in his life, Richard Langston felt small. Langston stared at the letter in Morgan Freeman's hands. His throat went dry. The man who wrote it, William Hargrove, was once a legend in business, a self-made billionaire, ruthless, feared. And just like Langston, he believed money was power. Yet at the end of his life, he had only regret. Langston's hands clenched at his sides. His mind raced. He remembered reading about Hargrove's lonely death in the news. The man had no family left, no friends, no one to mourn him. Was this what awaited him? He glanced at the audience. Their eyes weren't admiring him anymore. They were pitying him. Something inside Langston cracked, but his pride wouldn't let it show. He forced a smirk. "A touching story," he said, his voice colder than before. "But I'm not Hargrove. I built my legacy the right way. People respect me." Freeman nodded slowly. "And tell me, Mr. Langston," he said, his voice gentle but sharp, "how many of those people would visit your grave if you were gone tomorrow?" Langston's smirk faltered, because deep down, he already knew the answer. The audience could see it now. Langston was shaken. He had spent his entire life proving he was better than everyone else, that he was stronger, that he was untouchable. But for the first time, he felt small. Morgan Freeman saw it too. He sighed and leaned forward slightly, his eyes tired but knowing. "Let me ask you something, Mr. Langston," he said. "Do you ever sit in a dark room at night when the world is quiet and wonder if all of this," he gestured around the grand conference hall, "was worth it?" Langston's jaw tightened. He didn't answer, because he had. Many times, in his massive penthouse, surrounded by expensive paintings and city lights, he had sat alone, staring at his reflection in the glass, feeling empty. Freeman watched him carefully. "You see, Mr. Langston," he continued, "when the applause fades, when the spotlight turns off, when the world stops calling your name, what do you have left?" Langston's chest felt heavy, because in that moment, for the first time in his life, he didn't have an answer. The room was dead silent. No one dared to move. Langston's heart pounded. He hated how Freeman's words were getting to him. He wanted to argue, to fight back, but what could he say? Morgan Freeman, now 86 years old, had seen more of life than Langston ever had. He had met presidents, walked through history, and lived with a wisdom that could not be bought. Freeman sighed and sat back, folding the letter carefully. "I am not here to embarrass you, Mr. Langston," he said softly. "I am here to tell you the truth. And the truth is, you are afraid." Langston's breath caught. "Afraid?" he scoffed, trying to laugh it off. "Afraid of what?" Freeman's gaze didn't waver. "You are afraid of dying alone," he said. "Afraid of waking up one day and realizing you spent your life chasing things that do not matter." Langston's face went pale, because no matter how much he denied it, Freeman was right. And now, for the first time in his life, Richard Langston was truly afraid. Langston's throat felt tight. Freeman's words were cutting through him deeper than he wanted to admit. "You think I'm afraid?" Langston scoffed, trying to sound unaffected. "I'm the most powerful businessman in this room." Freeman simply nodded. "Yes," he said. "And yet you look like a man who hasn't slept peacefully in years." The room was still. Langston clenched his fists under the table. How could Freeman see it? The sleepless nights? The racing thoughts? The empty feeling that never left him no matter how much money he made? Freeman sighed. "I have met men like you before," he said, his voice softer now. "Men who carry wounds no one sees. But you cannot outrun them, Mr. Langston. You cannot buy your way out of them. And one day, when you are old and weak, they will come for you." Langston's fingers twitched. His breathing was shallow. Freeman studied him for a long moment before speaking again. "You think the world fears you," he said, "but you are the one who is afraid." Langston's vision blurred, because for the first time in his life, someone had spoken the truth he had been running from. Langston tried to shake off the feeling, but it clung to him like a shadow. He glanced at the faces around the room. They were watching him, not with admiration, but with pity. It made him sick. His whole life, he had built his empire on control, power, fear. But now, sitting under the weight of Morgan Freeman's words, he felt like a small boy again. A memory flashed in his mind. His father, a cold, ruthless man. A man who taught him that emotions were weakness, that love had no place in success. "Never let anyone see you weak, Richard," his father's voice echoed, "or they will destroy you." Langston had lived by those words. They had made him rich, respected, untouchable. But now, staring at Freeman's steady eyes, he felt something else. Regret. Freeman spoke again. "Tell me, Mr. Langston, when was the last time you truly looked into the eyes of someone who loved you?" Langston's heart stopped, because the truth hit him like a hammer. He couldn't remember. Langston looked down at his hands. His fingers trembled. He could feel the room watching him, waiting for his response. But for the first time in his life, he had nothing to say. Morgan Freeman's voice was gentle now. "You have spent your whole life building an empire," he said. "But tell me, Mr. Langston, who have you built it for?" Langston opened his mouth, but no words came, because he knew the answer. No one. His mother had died years ago. His father had never loved him. He had no wife, no children. The people who worked for him only stayed because of their paychecks. His entire life, he had been chasing something. And now, at the peak of his success, he realized he was utterly alone. A sharp pain twisted in his chest. For years, he had silenced his emotions, buried them deep. But now, they were rising like a tidal wave. And in front of a room full of people, in front of Morgan Freeman himself, Richard Langston felt like a broken man. Langston's vision blurred. His chest felt heavy. For years, he had prided himself on being untouchable. He had built walls so high that no one, not friends, not family, not even himself, could see what was inside. But Morgan Freeman had just torn those walls down with words. Freeman leaned forward, his voice softer now. "I have met men who thought they ruled the world," he said. "They controlled wealth, businesses, governments. But when the end came, and they lay in their hospital beds, they all asked the same question." Langston swallowed hard. "What question?" Freeman's eyes darkened. "Was it all worth it?" Langston's breath caught in his throat. For years he had told himself that money was everything, that respect, fear, and control were all he needed. But now, as he sat in this room, surrounded by people who respected his power but cared nothing for him, he felt something he had never felt before. Emptiness. For the first time in his life, Richard Langston realized he had built an empire, but he had no one to share it with. The room was unbearably silent. Langston's hands trembled as he stared at the table in front of him. His mind raced through every decision he had ever made, the employees he had fired without hesitation, the friends he had abandoned for business deals, the people who once loved him but eventually left, tired of chasing his attention. Freeman's words echoed in his head. "Who will stand beside you when the doors close?" Langston clenched his jaw. "You don't know me," he muttered, his voice weak. "You don't know what I've been through." Freeman nodded. "You're right. I don't know your story, but I know how it ends." Langston frowned. "How?" Freeman sighed. "I have seen men richer than you, more powerful than you, cry like children when they realize they spent their entire lives chasing the wrong things." Langston felt a sharp pain in his chest. He wasn't just listening anymore. He was seeing his own future. Something inside Langston snapped. The weight of his choices, the weight of his loneliness, the weight of every wrong decision. It was too much. His breath came in short gasps. The room around him seemed to spin. People were watching him. He could hear whispers. "Is he okay? I've never seen him like this. He looks broken." Langston clenched his fists, trying to pull himself together. He had spent his life being strong. He had never let anyone see his weakness. But now, he was breaking. Freeman's voice cut through the noise. "Mr. Langston," he said gently, "you don't have to carry it alone anymore." Langston's body tensed. He had spent years believing that vulnerability was weakness, that admitting he was lonely, or tired, or afraid would make him less of a man. But at this moment, sitting in a room full of people, he had never felt weaker in his life. And the worst part? He had done it to himself. Langston's chest felt tight. His heart pounded against his ribs. He had never felt this way before. Trapped. All his life he had been in control. He dictated the rules, called the shots, made the decisions. But now he felt powerless. Morgan Freeman's words were like a mirror, forcing him to face something he had avoided for years. The truth. "You have everything, Mr. Langston," Freeman said. "But in the end, when you close your eyes at night, does it bring you peace?" Langston wanted to scream, he wanted to argue, he wanted to fight back, but he couldn't. Because the truth was, he had no peace. His wealth meant nothing when he ate alone every night. His power meant nothing when there was no one to hold his hand in the dark. His empire meant nothing when there was no one to leave it to. For the first time in his life, Richard Langston felt something foreign. Tears. His vision blurred. His breathing shook. And in front of the entire room, in front of the man who had just broken him with words, the cocky billionaire lowered his head. The room was dead silent. No one had ever seen Richard Langston like this. His whole life, he had been the strongest man in the room, the untouchable force, the one who never showed weakness. But now, his shoulders shook, his hands trembled, his head was lowered, not in anger, but in defeat. Morgan Freeman didn't look at him with pity. He looked at him with something much deeper, understanding. "I was once like you, Mr. Langston," Freeman said softly. Langston slowly lifted his head, his eyes glossy. "I chased the world. I ran after success. I wanted to be remembered for my work," Freeman continued. "And I was." Langston sniffed, his jaw tight. "But do you know what I cherish most, now that I'm 86 years old?" Freeman asked. Langston swallowed hard. "What?" Freeman smiled gently. "The people I loved." A single tear slipped down Langston's face. Because he finally understood. He had spent his whole life chasing the wrong thing. The world expected Richard Langston to respond with pride, to argue, to storm out. Instead, he did something no one thought he ever would. He stood up. He took a deep, shaky breath. And in front of everyone, he spoke the words that had never left his mouth before. "I was wrong." The room gasped. Morgan Freeman nodded slowly, his eyes kind. Langston wiped his face and exhaled. "I've spent my entire life believing money was everything. That power was the only thing that mattered." His voice cracked. "But I was blind." Freeman smiled. "And now?" Langston turned to face the crowd. "I don't want to be the richest man in the graveyard," he whispered. "I want to be a man who lived, who loved, who gave." The room erupted in applause. Morgan Freeman leaned back, his work done. And for the first time in his life, Richard Langston felt something he had never known before. Peace. Dear viewers, if this story touched your heart, if it made you think about life, if it made you shed a tear, don't just leave without saying something. Tell me in the comments, what is the most valuable lesson you've learned in life? And if you believe in the power of wisdom, if you believe in kindness over arrogance, if you believe that life is about more than just money, like, share, and subscribe. Because at the end of the day, the only thing that truly matters is the legacy we leave behind. Thank you for watching.